Hey everyone, and welcome back. Are you ready to get into some geopolitics today?
Always ready for a good geopolitical puzzle.
Well, we've got a really interesting one for you today. We're going to be diving deep into the relationship between India, Nepal, and China.
Three countries with a lot of history and a whole lot of complexity in their relationships with each other.
Exactly. And to help us unpack it all, we're going to be looking at some excerpts from a book called India-Nepal Relations Under Chinese Influence. It's by Dr. Hemant, Kumar Pandey, and Akhilesh Dwivedi.
A very timely book, I have to say, given all the recent developments in the region.
Oh, absolutely. And it's got this really striking analogy. Right at the beginning, they describe Nepal as being like what was it?
A yam between two boulders.
Yes, that's it. A yam between two boulders, which I thought was just such a powerful image.
It's a great way to visualize Nepal's situation. They're this relatively small country, geographically sandwiched between these two giants, India and China.
Yeah. So they have to be very careful, very strategic in how they manage their relationships with both of them. Before we get into the current situation, though, I'm kind of curious about the historical backdrop. Like, what's the foundation of the relationship between India and Nepal? I know they have some really deep-rooted connections.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking centuries of cultural and religious exchange.
Oh, sure.
For instance, both countries revere Lord Buddha, whose birthplace is actually in Nepal.
Oh, that's right.
Even the epic Ramayana ties them together. A lot of key figures in the story came from regions that are now part of Nepal. And then you have the Roti Beti Karishta.
I've heard that phrase before, but I don't know what it means exactly.
It literally translates to bread and daughter. But what it really signifies is the close kinship through marriage and family ties between the two countries.
Oh, okay. So those connections go way, way back. How did things change when the British Empire came onto the scene, like back in the 18th century?
Well, it definitely added another layer of complexity. Nepal was already trying to maintain its independence.
Between a rising China and the
expanding British Raj, exactly.
So they were already doing this balancing act even back then.
Oh, for sure. It was a delicate situation for them.
All right, so let's jump forward now to the post-colonial era, when both India and Nepal gained their independence. What were some of the key developments in their relationship after that happened?
Well, a really pivotal moment was the 1950 Treaty of Peace and Friendship between India and Nepal.
Okay. So what did that treaty establish?
Basically, it established a kind of special relationship between the two countries. It was focused on cooperation, on stability in the region. And I think it's important to note that India did invest quite heavily in Nepal's development. They helped build roads, airports, even the Koshi Barrage, which is this huge dam on the Koshi River.
So it seems like it was a pretty solid foundation for their relationship.
It was, in many ways. But of course, things are never that simple.
Right. There's always more to the story. So what were some of the challenges or maybe points of tension that emerged, even with those seemingly good intentions?
Well, I think despite all the positive aspects, this treaty also sparked a debate within Nepal about their sovereignty. There were some who perceived this special relationship as a sign of India's dominance over them.
So even with these close ties and cooperation, there was still this sense of an imbalance, a power dynamic that wasn't always comfortable.
Exactly. And this perception, this feeling of being overshadowed by India, fueled some anti-India sentiment in certain circles in Nepal.
I see. So that makes sense. Even with close ties, that perception of an unequal power dynamic can breed resentment and mistrust. Did that open the door for China to step in?
In a way, yes. Nepal has always been very keen on maintaining its autonomy. And I think this desire for greater control over their own destiny led them to seek a more balanced relationship, not just with India, but with China as well.
Okay, so this idea of strategic autonomy, being able to chart their own course without being beholden to one country or the other, really starts to take shape.
Precisely. And this desire for a more balanced relationship actually led to some pretty dramatic moments in their history with India. For example, in 1988, Nepal decided to purchase arms from China.
Oh, wow. And how did India respond to that?
Not well. They saw this as a direct challenge, a sign that Nepal was moving away from them. And they responded with a 15-month blockade.
15 months? That's a huge deal. Clearly, they weren't messing around.
Definitely not. It really shows how high the stakes were, and it highlights just how sensitive India is to any perceived shift in Nepal's allegiances.
So while China might have been seen as this distant player before, this incident really brought them into the spotlight, right?
Yes, and I think it's important to understand that while historical connections existed between China and Nepal, China's influence really started to grow more rapidly after the 2006 peace agreement. That's when Nepal's civil war ended.
So China saw an opportunity to step in and fill a void.
You could say that.
Hmm.
And they were very strategic about it. They adopted what I would call a multi-pronged approach to building their relationship with Nepal.
Hmm. Multi-pronged. Huh. Okay, so break it down for me. What were those different prongs?
Well, first and foremost, they began pouring economic investment into Nepal. And a lot of this was channeled through infrastructure projects, often linked to their Belt and Road Initiative.
Oh, yeah, the BRI, their massive global infrastructure project. So they were using that as a way to increase their influence in Nepal.
Precisely. And we're talking about some big-ticket projects here. Things like the Arnaco Highway, the Kathmandu Ring Road, even the Pokhara Regional International Airport.
Wow, so they were really making their presence known, not just with small-scale aid, but with these huge, high-visibility infrastructure projects.
Exactly. They wanted to make a statement, but infrastructure was just one part of their strategy. They also started providing aid to the Nepal army.
Oh, so they were playing the military diplomacy game as well? Providing training and equipment?
Yeah.
Interesting. What else were they doing?
Well, they also significantly ramped up cultural exchanges. Things like student scholarships, cultural delegations, that sort of thing. It was all about building goodwill and strengthening those people-to-people connections.
Okay, so it's a pretty comprehensive approach then, investing in infrastructure, providing military aid, fostering cultural ties.
Yeah, very strategic. But there's another aspect of their approach that I think is particularly noteworthy, and that's their policy of non-interference in Nepal's internal affairs.
Interesting. So how has that played out? I mean, on the surface, it sounds like a good thing, right? Respecting Nepal's sovereignty, not meddling in their politics.
Right, and it's definitely been a point of contrast with India, which has sometimes been seen as a bit heavy-handed in its dealings with Nepal.
Yeah.
So this non-interference policy has resonated with some in Nepal who are wary of India's influence.
Yeah, I can see how that would be appealing to them, but I imagine there are some who see it differently, right?
Oh, absolutely. There are always multiple perspectives to consider. And some argue that this non-interference policy is really just a way for China to gain influence without having to take responsibility for any negative consequences of their actions.
Ah, so it's not as straightforward as it seems on the surface. There's a whole other layer to it. This is fascinating stuff. So we've got this complex historical backdrop, and then these two major powers, India and China, both vying for influence in Nepal. It's like a geopolitical tug of war. So how has Nepal, the yam between two boulders, tried to navigate this very tricky situation?
Well, that's a question we'll dive into next time.
Okay, well, I guess we'll leave our listeners in suspense for now. But before we go, I just want to say a huge thank you for joining us today. We've covered a lot of ground, from historical ties to the current power dynamics. And next time, we'll delve deeper into how Nepal is trying to maintain its balance in this increasingly complex geopolitical landscape. Stay tuned. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're ready for round 2 of our deep dive into the India-Nepal-China triangle. Before the break, we were talking about how Nepal is trying to maintain its balance between its two powerful neighbors, India and China. And I'm really curious, is China's approach in Nepal part of a larger strategy, do you think? Like, are they following a playbook here?
That's a great question. And I think to answer that, we need to zoom out a bit and look at China's broader foreign policy objectives. What are their overall goals on the world stage? And I think their economic diplomacy, especially through the Belt and Road Initiative, is a prime example of how they're expanding their global influence. And you can definitely see that playing out in Nepal.
So you're saying these massive infrastructure projects in Nepal, like the highways and the airport we talked about, they're not just about helping Nepal, they're also about furthering China's own ambitions.
Exactly. By investing in this kind of infrastructure, particularly projects that connect Nepal to China, they're creating economic dependencies and strengthening their strategic foothold in the region. Think of it like a modern-day Silk Road with China at the center.
It's a pretty powerful image, and it really highlights how interconnected everything is these days. It's not just about economics either, right? You mentioned earlier that China also provides aid to the Nepal army.
Right. This military diplomacy, providing training and equipment, it's another way that China is increasing its influence. And it's all part of this comprehensive strategy they have, a very multifaceted approach.
So how has India responded to all of this? I mean, they've been the dominant player in Nepal for decades, but now they're facing a real challenge from China. How are they adapting to this new reality?
Well, India is definitely trying to counter China's influence, but I think it's been a wake-up call for them. They're now increasing their own investments in Nepal, working to strengthen those diplomatic ties, really emphasizing the historical and cultural connections they have.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how they're sort of having to step up their game now that there's this competition. Do you think they can catch up, though, or is it too little too late? I mean, China seems to have a pretty significant head start.
It's a tough situation for India for sure. But they still have some key advantages. I mean, there's that deep people-to-people connection, the shared language and culture, the open border, and the extensive family ties between the two countries. That's a level of intimacy that China simply can't replicate.
It's true. You can't just manufacture that kind of closeness. Those connections run deep.
Exactly. And then there's the geographic proximity. India shares a much longer border with Nepal than China does, and their economies are very closely intertwined. So
Yeah.
it's definitely not a lost cause for India, but they do need to adapt, like you said, to this new reality where they're no longer the only game in town.
So what would a more effective strategy for India look like in this context? Like, how can they reassert themselves in a way that's not just about countering China, but about building a genuinely stronger relationship with Nepal?
I think it starts with moving away from that big brother approach that they've sometimes been accused of.
Yeah.
That sort of paternalistic way of dealing with Nepal. They need to embrace a more collaborative relationship where they recognize Nepal as a truly equal partner.
Okay, so a more balanced, more respectful approach. What would that look like in practice?
Well, it would involve greater economic and development cooperation, but not just in a way that benefits India, but in a way that genuinely benefits both countries. And it also means being more sensitive to Nepal's domestic political concerns and being willing to address some of those long-standing issues like the Madhesi question that we talked about before.
Right, so it's about listening to their needs, understanding their priorities, and working together to find solutions that benefit everyone.
That's the idea. It's about building trust and demonstrating a genuine commitment to Nepal's success.
So we've talked about these external pressures from India and China, but what about the internal political dynamics within Nepal itself? How does all of this play into what's happening domestically?
That's actually a crucial piece of the puzzle that we haven't really touched on yet. Nepal has gone through a lot of political turmoil in recent years, multiple changes in government, that long process of drafting a new constitution. It's been a pretty bumpy road for them politically.
I imagine that makes it even harder to assert their autonomy on the international stage when you're dealing with so much instability at home.
Oh, absolutely. And unfortunately, that kind of internal weakness can sometimes be exploited by those external powers that we were talking about before.
So it's almost like a vicious cycle then. The more internal instability there is, the more vulnerable they become to external pressure, which then can further exacerbate that instability.
It can, yeah. It's a very delicate situation, and it really underscores the importance of having a strong and stable government that can effectively represent Nepal's interests on the world stage.
So how do you see Nepal's internal politics evolving in the coming years? Are there any signs that they might be able to achieve greater stability?
Well, it's always difficult to predict the future, especially when it comes to politics. But I think there are some reasons to be cautiously optimistic.
Oh, that's good to hear. What makes you say that?
Well, for one thing, the new constitution, despite its flaws, has laid the groundwork for a more inclusive and democratic Nepal. And it seems like there's a growing recognition among the political elite that they need to put aside their differences and work together to address the challenges facing the country.
So it sounds like there's a sense that they're all in this together, that they need to find common ground and work towards a shared future.
Exactly. And that's a positive sign. It's a reminder that even small nations can exert their agency and shape their own destiny, even when facing those pressures from larger powers.
I love that. It's a message of hope and resilience. It's a reminder that the human spirit can overcome incredible odds.
I agree. And it's something that we see time and time again throughout history.
Okay, so we've covered the historical ties, the shifting power dynamics, the security concerns, and now the internal political landscape of Nepal. This has been a truly insightful deep dive. We're getting a real sense of the complexity of the situation.
It really is a fascinating case study. It shows how interconnected everything is. You can't just look at the relationship between two countries in isolation. You have to understand the broader context, the regional dynamics, the internal politics of each country, and how all of those factors interact and influence each other.
Right. It's like a giant puzzle where all the pieces are constantly moving and shifting, and it makes you realize just how much is at stake here, not just for Nepal, but for the entire region.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to understand
Yeah.
these dynamics and to have these kinds of conversations.
Well said. So where do we go from here? I mean, what does the future hold for India-Nepal relations under this growing influence of China? What are some of the potential scenarios that could unfold?
Now that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's tough to predict the future with any certainty, especially in a region as dynamic as South Asia. But I think we can explore some of the possibilities, some of the different paths that this could all take.
I'm all yours. What are some of the scenarios you see playing out?
Well, one possibility is that Nepal continues to skillfully navigate between India and China, maintaining that strategic autonomy that we talked about earlier, leveraging the competition between them to their own advantage.
Yeah, kind of playing both sides and coming out ahead. Is that a realistic possibility, though?
It's definitely possible.
Yeah.
But it requires some very deft diplomacy. They have to be really careful not to alienate either side. And they need to have a very clear understanding of their own national interests. What are their goals? What are their red lines? And then they need to be able to communicate those effectively to both India and China.
And maybe a little bit of luck wouldn't hurt either.
A little bit of luck never hurts in geopolitics, that's for sure. So that's one scenario, the optimistic one where everyone plays their cards right and things work out relatively smoothly. But what if this balancing act fails? What are some of the other potential outcomes?
Okay, so let's go down that road for a minute. What happens if things don't go according to plan?
Well, if Nepal is seen as tilting too far toward China, it could trigger a more assertive, perhaps even aggressive, response from India. And we've already seen how India reacted when Nepal purchased arms from China back in the 80s, so it's not something to take lightly.
Right, and with the current tensions between India and China, I imagine any misstep could escalate pretty quickly.
Absolutely. That's the danger here. There's always that risk that things could spiral out of control, especially in a region that already has so many unresolved disputes.
So it's a delicate balancing act for Nepal. They have to walk this very fine line between pursuing their own interests and not provoking either of these giants.
Exactly. It's like walking a tightrope. One wrong step and everything could come crashing down.
Okay, so let's say for a moment that Nepal does manage to maintain this balancing act. What does that mean for India? How do they need to adjust their thinking, their approach to Nepal in this new reality?
It means India has to fundamentally rethink its approach to Nepal. The days of assuming dominance and control are over.
So they need to start viewing Nepal as a truly independent actor with its own legitimate interests.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond that zero-sum mentality, that idea that any gain for Nepal is automatically a loss for India. They need to embrace a more cooperative, a more partnership-based approach.
So what would that look like in practice? How does India shift from this big brother mentality to a more equal partnership?
Well, as I mentioned before, it involves greater economic and development cooperation, but not just in a way that benefits India, but in a way that genuinely benefits both countries. And it also means being more sensitive to Nepal's domestic political concerns and being willing to address some of those long-standing issues, like the Madhesi question, in a constructive and equitable way.
So it's not just about grand gestures and big projects, but also about understanding and addressing those smaller day-to-day concerns that impact people's lives.
Exactly. It's about building trust. It's about demonstrating respect for Nepal's sovereignty. It's about recognizing that they are a valuable partner, not just a pawn in a geopolitical game.
And that's a really important point, isn't it? I mean, I think sometimes we get so caught up in the power dynamics and the strategic maneuvering that we forget about the human element.
We do. And it's important to remember that at the end of the day, this is about people. It's about their lives, their hopes, their dreams for the future.
It's a good reminder to keep things in perspective. Okay, so we've talked a lot about India, but what about China? What do you think their long-term goals are in Nepal? Are they just looking for short-term gains, or are they playing a longer game?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that Nepal is a strategically important country for China. It's a gateway to South Asia, a potential source of natural resources, and a key link in their Belt and Road initiative. So they're definitely thinking long-term here.
And as their economic and military power continues to grow, their influence in Nepal is only going to increase, right?
That seems like a pretty safe bet, yeah. I mean, they're not going anywhere. And they're very patient. They're willing to play the long game.
It all brings us back to that analogy of Nepal as the yam between two boulders. It's a delicate position to be in, caught between these two giants. What do you think? What's your take on how this might play out in the long run?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but I think there are a couple of broad scenarios that we could imagine. One is that Nepal manages to maintain this balancing act we've been talking about, successfully navigating between India and China, leveraging the competition between them to their own advantage.
That would be the ideal outcome for Nepal, wouldn't it? Kind of playing both sides and coming out ahead.
It would. But it's a very difficult path to navigate. It requires a lot of skill, a lot of finesse, and like we said, a little bit of luck.
So what's the other scenario? The less optimistic one.
The alternative is that Nepal is forced to choose sides, or is perceived as choosing sides, which could lead to increased tensions, maybe even conflict.
So in that scenario, everyone loses.
Pretty much, yeah. It would be a very destabilizing outcome for the entire region.
It's a sobering thought. It really highlights the high stakes involved here. I wonder what our listener thinks about all of this.
Yes. What do you think? How do you see this playing out?
It's a question worth considering, for sure. How should Nepal position itself in this complex geopolitical landscape? What are the potential risks and rewards of different approaches? There's a lot to unpack there.
Definitely. It's a real-life, strategic puzzle with some pretty high stakes. And I think it's important to remember that even small actions can have big consequences in this kind of situation.
Right. It's not just about the big pronouncements and the formal agreements, but also about those subtle shifts in policy and those day-to-day interactions that can really shape the relationship over time.
Absolutely. And I think if we look back at the 1988 blockade, when Nepal purchased arms from China, it really highlights just how sensitive India is to shifts in Nepal's alliances. I mean, they responded with a 15-month blockade, which is a pretty dramatic move.
Yeah, that's not exactly a subtle response. It really underscores how seriously they take this relationship.
And I think in the current geopolitical climate, where tensions between India and China are already high, any move by Nepal that's perceived as favoring China could potentially trigger a strong reaction from India, even if it's not intentional.
So there's not a lot of room for error here. Nepal really has to tread carefully.
They do. And I think that highlights the importance of communication and diplomacy. Open dialogue between all three countries is really crucial to avoid misunderstandings and prevent things from escalating.
It sounds like everyone needs to be very careful, very deliberate in their actions and their words.
Exactly. There's a real need for clear communication, for building trust, for finding ways to cooperate that benefit everyone involved.
So we've talked about what Nepal needs to do, but what about India? What would a more cooperative approach from their side look like, in your opinion? How can they adapt to this new reality where they're no longer the only major player in Nepal?
Well, I think the first step is for India to really recognize Nepal as a truly independent actor with its own legitimate interests. They need to move away from that zero-sum mentality, that idea that any gain for Nepal is automatically a loss for India.
So it's about embracing a more win-win approach.
Exactly. It's about understanding that a strong and prosperous Nepal is actually in India's best interests as well.
Right. It makes sense. But how do they translate that into concrete actions? How do they move beyond the rhetoric and actually build a more equal partnership?
Well, it starts with greater economic and development cooperation, but not just in a way that benefits India. They need to focus on projects and initiatives that genuinely benefit both countries, that help to uplift the people of Nepal and strengthen their economy.
Okay, so it's about being a true partner, not just a patron.
Exactly. And it also means being more sensitive to Nepal's domestic political concerns, being willing to address those long-standing issues like the Madhesi question in a way that is fair and equitable for everyone involved.
So it's not just about the big flashy projects, but also about those smaller, everyday issues that can really impact people's lives.
Precisely. It's about building trust and demonstrating respect for Nepal's sovereignty. It's about recognizing that they are a valuable partner, not just a pawn in some geopolitical game.
Well said. It's a good reminder that even in these complex geopolitical situations, it always comes back to the human element. The relationships between people, between countries, they're built on trust and mutual respect.
They are. And I think it's important to remember that history plays a role in all of this as well. There's a lot of baggage, a lot of past grievances that can sometimes make it difficult to move forward.
Right. It's like you're always carrying that weight of history with you, even as you're trying to build something new.
Exactly. But I think it's also important to recognize that the world is changing, and these relationships need to evolve as well.
Yeah, you can't just keep doing things the same way and expect different results. So we've talked a lot about India, but what about China? We've touched on their strategy so far, but what are their long-term goals in Nepal? Are they just looking for short-term gains, or are they playing a longer game here?
Well, I think all signs point to China playing the long game in Nepal. They clearly see the country's strategic importance. It's a gateway to South Asia, a potential source of natural resources, and a key link in their Belt and Road Initiative.
So they're not just dipping their toes in the water. They're fully committed to this relationship.
It seems that way, yeah. And they're very patient. They're willing to invest time and resources to build those relationships, to cultivate those connections.
And with their economic and military power continuing to grow, it's likely that their influence in Nepal will only continue to increase as well.
I think that's a safe assumption, yeah. They're a force to be reckoned with, that's for sure.
It really is a fascinating situation, isn't it? This whole dynamic between India, Nepal, and China. It's like a real-life geopolitical drama playing out right before our eyes. And it brings us back to that analogy of Nepal as the yam between two boulders. How do you see this all playing out in the long run? Do you have any predictions?
Well, like I said before, predictions are always risky, especially in this kind of situation. But if I had to guess, I'd say there are two main scenarios that could unfold.
Okay, I'm ready. Give me the good scenario and the bad scenario.
All right, well, the good scenario, the optimistic one, is that Nepal somehow manages to maintain this delicate balancing act that they've been performing. They continue to navigate between India and China, leveraging the competition between them to their own advantage. They play their cards right, and they come out ahead.
That would be a win for Nepal for sure. But it sounds like a pretty tough road to navigate.
It is. It requires a lot of skill, a lot of strategic thinking, and probably a bit of luck as well. But it's not impossible.
So what's the less optimistic scenario? The one we should be worried about?
Well, the alternative is that Nepal is forced to choose sides, or even just perceived as choosing sides. And that could lead to increased tensions in the region, maybe even conflict.
So in that scenario, no one really wins, everyone loses.
Pretty much, yeah. It would be a very destabilizing outcome, not just for Nepal, but for the entire region.
Wow. It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it?
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. I feel like I've learned so much about this complex relationship between India, Nepal, and China, but it also feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
There's always more to learn, isn't there? And I think that's one of the most exciting things about these kinds of deep dives. They really make you think about the world in new ways. They do. And hopefully they inspire our listeners to do some of their own exploring as well, to delve deeper into these topics that interest them, to seek out different perspectives, to really engage with the world around them. And hey, maybe this will inspire you to suggest a topic for our next deep dive. What are you curious about? What mysteries of the world would you like us to unravel? Until next time, thanks for joining us on this fascinating exploration of the complex dynamics between India, Nepal, and China.